Lakota chief was the last of his mother's line. A white healer bore his son and was loved. The horse died on a Tuesday. I know it was Tuesday because I had counted the days since the fever broke in the camp, 12 days of bad air and 3 children buried. And that morning when Hanska went down in the frozen creek bed with all 4 legs folded under him like he was kneeling to pray, I stood there and I thought, 12 days, and now this too. I did not weep for the horse. I had not wept in a long time. I stood in the cold with my boots soaking through, and I watched the steam rise off his flank, and I thought of my mother, the way she used to say that the land always took back what it needed. She said it in Lakota, and she said it in the broken French she learned from the fur trader who wintered near our camp when she was a girl. She was a woman who used whatever language fit the moment. I am telling you about the horse because that is where she first saw me. Not at my best. Not on horseback with my war shirt and my people at my back. She saw me standing in a frozen creek with my boots ruined, one hand resting on a dead horse's neck, and according to her, that is exactly when she decided I was worth knowing. Her name was Nora Aldred. She would correct me on the pronunciation if she were here, the D at the end, soft, almost swallowed. She came out with the mission supply wagon that fall, which was late and half-rotted and driven by a man named Cross who drank through the whole run from Bismarck and who left 3 crates of food short of what he'd been paid to deliver. The medicine in the wagon was hers. She'd packed it herself in oilskin, and she'd ridden sitting on top of it for 11 days to make sure it didn't freeze. She wasn't a mission woman. She wasn't a nun or a preacher's wife or any of the things the Indian agent kept trying to explain her as. She was a healer. She had trained under a physician in St. Louis, a man named Creed who apparently believed women were capable of learning medicine, which made him unusual and, from what she told me, deeply unpopular at his club. She had a set of tools she kept in a leather roll: bone saws, forceps, needles curved like fish hooks, thread that smelled of carbolic. She knew how to set a broken leg and how to take a bullet out of a man's shoulder without killing him, and how to mix a tincture for fever that actually worked, as opposed to the sugar water the agency doctor had been sending us for 3 years. She was 31 years old when she came to our camp. She had pale reddish hair she kept pinned under a wool hat, and she had cold chapped hands, and she stood about 5'3". And she looked at me across that frozen creek bed with no expression I could read, which was the first thing about her that interested me. Most white people looked at me with fear or performance. Either they went stiff and careful, watching for the thing they'd heard about, or they became very eager and very loud, demonstrating their goodwill like it was something they needed me to confirm. Nora Aldred looked at me the way you look at a problem you are trying to solve. Not unkind, just awake. She said in plain English, "Is the horse yours?" I said it was. She said, "Did it fall or go down?" I told her it went down, all at once, probably the heart. She said, "Good, then the meat's clean." And she turned and called something back toward the wagon, and 2 men came down, and she directed them on how to get the carcass up without fouling it. I stood in the creek and I watched her organize 3 men and a dead horse in about 4 minutes flat, and I thought, my mother would have liked this woman. My mother was Wombly Ska Y, White Eagle woman. She was the last daughter of a line of women who had held certain knowledge in this band for as long as anyone could recall. Not chieftains. We were not a people where women held that title, though in truth the distinction always seemed to me more ceremony than reality. What my mother's line held was something harder to name: keepers of the winter counts, carriers of certain medicines. The ones other women came to when the birth was wrong, or the child wasn't speaking by the age it should, or a man came home from war with his eyes gone somewhere no one could reach. She had 3 daughters, and then she had me. My father was a good man, steady and quiet, who died of a chest ailment when I was 7. My mother raised me alongside my sisters, and she taught me what she could. She said once that the knowledge didn't pass only through daughters, that it passed through whoever paid attention. I paid attention. When she died, I was 24. She was not old. It was a hard winter and a harder spring. She left me with a particular weight. Not grief, though there was grief too. She left me with the fact of the line ending. My sisters had all died before her, 2 from illness, 1 in a raid the year before. I was the last of her blood, and the things she knew, I was the only one carrying them. I became chief of this band at 32. Not because of my mother's line, though that didn't hurt, because I was the one still standing who knew how to do the job. Half the men older than me were dead or gone. The agent wanted someone he could manage. He looked at me, and I think he saw a big, quiet man who might be manageable. He was wrong, but I didn't see any value in correcting him immediately. By the time Nora Aldred came with her oilskin-wrapped medicines and her horse assessment skills and her complete indifference to whether I found her useful or not, I had been chief for 6 years. I had kept this band alive through 2 bad winters, 1 epidemic, a land survey that tried to cut our grazing range in half, and an agency superintendent named Birch who had a talent for losing our annuity payments somewhere between the territorial capital and our camp. I had done all of this largely alone, meaning without anyone I could speak to plainly, because the weight of being chief is partly the weight of not showing the weight. That is what I want you to understand before I tell you the rest of it. Not that I was a great man or a hard man, or any of the things men say to make themselves sound worth listening to. I want you to understand that by the time I was 38 years old, I had been carrying something alone for a very long time, and I had gotten so accustomed to the weight of it that I had stopped noticing I was bent. She stayed. That is the part I never quite expected. The mission supply wagon left after 4 days. Cross and his men took the wagon back north, and I watched them go, and I thought, now she'll go too. She'd made arrangements to go, as far as I knew. She had said something to the agent's assistant about the next supply run in February. She did not go. She came to find me. I was down near the corrals, working on a fence post that had heaved out of the frozen ground, and she said, plainly as anything, I'd like to stay through the winter if you'll have me. You've got 3 children still sick and 2 women I'm worried about. I can help more than I can hurt. I looked at her for a long moment. She had her wool hat on and her breath was clouding, and she had mud on her coat from where she'd been kneeling in the lodge where the sickest child was. I said, why? Not why stay, just why. I wanted to know what she was after. She thought about that for a moment, not performing the thought, actually thinking. Then she said, because I'm good at this and there's nowhere else right now where I'm as useful, and because I don't like leaving things unfinished. That was all. No speech about the Indian cause or God's work, or the nobility of the primitive, or any of the words that usually came wrapped around white people doing things in our camp. Just, I'm good at this, there's need. I don't like leaving things unfinished. I told her she could stay. I gave her the lodge next to the medicine woman, old Tehinchala, who was near 80, and who I fully expected to spend the winter ignoring this white woman entirely. By December they were sharing a fire every morning, communicating in some language made of gesture, and the 30 words of Lakota Nora had picked up. And Tehinchala had shown her 3 things about the root medicines she hadn't shown anyone in 20 years. That is the kind of woman Nora Aldred was. I did not pursue her. I want to be plain about that because I've heard how this story gets told sometimes, the chief and the white woman, and the telling usually makes it sound like he took her or claimed her or at minimum overwhelmed her with his presence. That is not what happened. What happened is that she began finding reasons to speak with me. Not romantically, nothing like that, not at first. She had questions. She wanted to understand how the band was organized, what the actual relationships were between people, who answered to whom and who didn't answer to anyone, and who I needed to be careful with. She said she'd made mistakes in other places by not understanding the human structure of a community before she worked in it. She didn't want to make those mistakes here. I answered her questions, and I found myself answering more than she asked. Things I hadn't said to anyone. The situation with Birch and the missing annuities. The survey and what we'd lost. The fact that half my young men were gone, some to the agencies further east, some to the whiskey traders, some just gone in that way men go when they can't see a future. She listened. She didn't offer solutions to things she didn't understand, and she didn't offer comfort in the way that is really just someone wanting to stop hearing about a hard thing. She just listened with that same awake quality I'd noticed in the creek bed. Like a problem she was trying to understand all the way through before she said anything about it. One evening, it was deep into January, the cold the kind that makes the air look solid, she brought me a tin cup of something she'd heated on her fire. Some kind of herb tea, bitter and sharp. She set it on the ground next to where I was sitting and she sat down herself and she said, "You're tired." Not a question. She said it like a plain observation. I didn't deny it. I looked at the fire and I said, "Yes." She said, "How long?" I thought about it. I said, "Since my mother died." She was quiet for a while. The fire popped. Outside, the wind was moving across the camp and you could hear the hides of the lodges shifting. She said, "Who did she tell things to, before you?" I looked at her then. She said the things she knew. Who did she tell before you were old enough to carry them? There must have been someone. I told her, no one. My father was gone by then. Her sisters, my aunts, were all dead or far. She'd told me as much as she could and the rest she took with her. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That must be a particular kind of lonely, knowing things no one else knows, no one to check with, no one to ask if you remembered something right." I did not say anything for a long time. I said yes. She picked up the tin cup from the ground and held it out to me again. I hadn't touched it. She didn't say anything, just held it out. I took it. That is the moment I would point to if someone asked me when I began to love her. Not when she was beautiful, though she was. Not when she was brave, though she was that too. It was that question, who did she tell things to before you, and the fact that she had understood something about my life that I had never been able to put into words for myself. But I did not do anything about it, not for a long time. Partly because she was a guest in my camp and that carried obligations I wasn't willing to dishonor. Partly because I did not think she would want. I didn't know what she would want. She was a woman who had arranged her own life in a particular way. She had chosen her work over other things. I did not assume I knew what she'd give that up for, or if anything. And partly, if I am honest, because I was afraid. I had not let anyone close since my mother, not close enough to matter if they left. And everything left. Horses died in frozen creeks and children got buried in hard ground, and women with red hair under wool hats got on supply wagons back to Bismarck in February. So I did nothing, and she did nothing or nothing obvious. We talked most evenings. She told me about St. Louis and about Dr. Creed and about a brother she had in Ohio who she corresponded with but rarely saw. I told her things about this country, not the story things, the ceremony things you tell to satisfy the curious, but the real things, the practical and the personal, where the ground was good, where the water ran wrong, what my mother had said about the winter of my grandfather's time. By March she was more fluent in Lakota than the agent's interpreter, and the children in camp had started bringing her small objects, a bone, a bead, a piece of quartz, as gifts, which is not a thing Lakota children do lightly. She asked me once if that meant something, the gifts. I said, "It means they trust you." She turned the little piece of quartz over in her fingers, and she said quietly, "I'm not used to being trusted." I wanted to ask her about that. I didn't that night, but I thought about it for a long time afterward. The man who came in April was named Harlan Prout, and he was the new superintendent. Birch had finally been removed. Apparently someone in the territorial capital had noticed the pattern in the annuity accounts, and Prout came up from Kansas with papers and a riding coat and a great deal of confidence. He was not a bad man, precisely. He was a man who had been told things about how these arrangements were supposed to work, and who intended to make them work that way, which is its own kind of dangerous. He had ideas about the Indian camps he was overseeing. Progress. Consolidation. He used the word civilization the way some men use the word necessary, as if the matter were already settled and anyone who disagreed was simply behind. He looked at Nora the first time he came to the camp with an expression I recognized. Not quite lust, not quite outrage. Something between them. A white woman living in an Indian camp, working outside the mission structure, sleeping under a lodge skin 10 yards from the chief's quarters. It didn't fit the picture he had of how things should be. He spoke to her privately, or tried to. I don't know exactly what he said. She told me afterward, her face very still in the way it got when she was managing something she found genuinely offensive. He'd suggested, apparently, that her continued presence in the camp was creating a misimpression. Among the Indians, he meant, about the relationship between herself and the chief. He'd said it with what she described as great delicacy and concern for her reputation. She told him that her relationship with the chief was not his business and her reputation was her own affair, and that she had 2 more women in the camp who needed monitoring through the spring, and she would leave when she decided she was finished, not when he decided it was inconvenient. She told me this standing outside her lodge with her arms crossed and her jaw set, and when she finished she said, "I should have said something worse, but I couldn't think of it fast enough." I told her what she said seemed sufficient. She looked at me for a moment. Something shifted in her face. She said, "He's going to make trouble for you, you know, not just for me. He's going to look for ways to make trouble." I said I knew that. She said, "Is there anything I can do to help with that?" Practically, not just, "I'm not asking to be useful in exchange for staying. I mean, is there something real I can do?" I looked at her. The afternoon light was coming sideways across the camp, long and gold, the way it gets in April when the thaw is starting to hold. I said, "You're already doing it. You've kept 4 people alive this winter who might not have lived otherwise. You've given Tehinchala someone to pass her knowledge to when she goes. The children trust you. My people trust you. That is not nothing to me." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's not what I meant exactly." I said I knew what she meant. She looked at me and I looked at her, and we had one of those conversations that happens without words, the kind where you can feel the whole question of a thing hanging in the air between you. I did not push it. I let it hang. She said eventually, "All right," just that, and she went back into her lodge. Prout came back in May with a surveyor and 2 men, and a set of papers about a new boundary for the camp's grazing range. It was a reduction, not as bad as the one they'd tried 3 years before, but bad enough. He wanted my mark on the papers. I did not give him my mark. I told him I needed to speak with the other headmen and that we would answer in 10 days. He didn't like that, but he accepted it, because he was new enough to the position that he still thought procedure mattered. During those 10 days I worked. I wrote letters. I had learned to write English from a missionary when I was young, one of those things my mother encouraged, because she said a man who could only speak one language gave half his power away, and I sent them to the Indian Rights Organization in Chicago that a lawyer named Fulton had told me about the previous year. I wrote to Fulton directly. I put together every account I had of the boundary violations under Birch, the missing annuities, the survey from 3 years before. Nora helped me. Not with the arguments, those were mine, but with the letters themselves, the English of them, making sure what I meant on the page was what I intended to say. She would read something I'd written and she would say, "This part, they'll read this as anger and dismiss it. Can you say it another way?" Or, "This is the strongest part right here. This should come first, not buried in the middle." She understood something about how to move people toward a thing. She'd had to, I suppose. A woman in medicine in 1882, you learned how to get what you needed through the door people were actually willing to open. We sat at my fire most of those evenings, papers between us. Sometimes she'd fall asleep over the letters, her head dropping and then jerking up and then dropping again, and I'd put my blanket around her shoulders without saying anything about it and go on working. The fifth night she didn't jerk awake, she slept against my shoulder. I sat very still, the fire burned down. When she woke, she lifted her head and looked at me, and she did not say I'm sorry or how embarrassing or any of the things I expected. She just looked at me with her clear gray eyes and she said, "Did you sleep at all?" I said, "Some." She said, "You're lying." I said, "Yes." She looked at me for a long time. The camp was quiet. It was very late. She said, "Itunka," which she had learned from one of the older women and which means, roughly, patient one. Or maybe the one who waits. The words cross over. I said, "Nora." She said in English, "I'm not leaving. I want you to know that. Whatever happens with Prout and the papers and all of it, I'm not getting on that wagon." I said, "You might have to, if things go badly." She said, "I'm not leaving." I said more quietly, "Why?" And she said, looking at me the way she had looked at me in the creek bed that first day, solving a problem, seeing it clearly, she said, "Because this is where I'm needed. And because you're the most honest man I've ever known. And because I'm in love with you, which I expect you already knew." I did know. And I had known she knew I knew, which is a particular kind of thing between two people, both knowing, neither saying, holding it like something that might break if you named it. But she named it. I put my hand over hers, there on the papers, and I said, "I've been carrying my mother's line alone for 14 years. She waited. I said, "I would like someone to carry it with me." She turned her hand under mine and held it, and that was that. I should tell you about Prout, because we're not done with him. The letters worked partly. Fulton wrote back. The Indian rights people wrote back. Enough noise got made in the right places that the boundary papers got sent back to the territorial capital for review, and Prout spent the summer waiting for an answer and being furious about it in a quiet, administrative way. What he did while he was waiting was try to remove Nora. He wrote to the mission board she had a loose affiliation with. She'd been under their general umbrella for purposes of the supply wagon, though she wasn't their employee exactly, and he told them her continued presence was a disruption to the management of the camp and that she was acting in ways inconsistent with her mission. He was careful not to say anything specific, because there was nothing specific to say. He wrapped it in vague language about influence and impressions. The mission board sent a letter to Nora asking her to report to Bismarck for a review. She did not go. She wrote back to the board a letter of 3 pages that I read afterward, and that remains, to my mind, one of the most precise and devastating documents I have ever encountered. She laid out what she had done in the camp over 9 months. She named each patient. She listed every medicine she had administered and the outcome. She described the condition of the agency's own medical provision, or rather, the near-total absence of it. She said, and I remember this part because I've turned it over many times since, that she had not been sent to this camp by any authority other than her own judgment, and that her judgment was that her patients needed her and she intended to stay with them, and that if the board wished to remove their nominal affiliation from her work, she welcomed the clarity. The board did not write back. Prout tried once more in the fall. He came to the camp himself in September with 2 agency police, Lakota men from another band who he thought would give his arrival some weight. And he came to my lodge and he told me, standing in the entrance with his hat in his hands, that he had concerns about the nature of Miss Aldred's relationship with myself and the effect it was having on the camp's relations with the agency. I let him finish. Then I said, "Nora is my wife." He blinked. He said, "I'm not aware of any. There was no ceremony registered with." I said, "There was a ceremony. In August. My people witnessed it. Tehinchala conducted it, which is fitting since she is the oldest keeper of such things in this band. He looked at me. He looked past me, where Nora was sitting at the fire with her back to us, pretending to work on something, and I could tell from the set of her shoulders, absolutely listening. He said, very carefully, "That won't be recognized by the territorial." I said, "I am aware of what is recognized and what is not. I am telling you what is true." He stood there for a moment. The two Lakota policemen behind him were looking at the ground. He said, "There will be consequences to this arrangement." I said, "There are consequences to every arrangement. I've been managing consequences for a long time. Is there anything else?" He left. Nora turned from the fire and looked at me, and she was trying not to smile and failing, and she said, "Pretending to work on something." I said, "I noticed." She got up and came to where I was standing, and she put her hands on my face. She had to reach up to do it, and she looked at me and she said, "Itunka." I covered her hands with mine. The boundary papers came back from the capital in October, and what we got was not everything we asked for, but it was more than Prout had wanted to give us, and it had the signatures of 3 men who could not easily be ignored. Fulton wrote that it was a better outcome than he'd expected. I wrote back that better than expected was still not good, but that we would take what we'd won and come back for the rest. That winter was hard, cold in the way that stops being weather and starts being the world's actual disposition. We lost 2 elders in December, which I had expected. They had both been failing since summer. We kept everyone else. Nora was pregnant by then. She didn't tell me immediately. She'd kept it to herself for about 6 weeks, until one morning she simply said it, plain as anything, the way she said everything that mattered. She said, "I'm going to have your child in the spring. I wanted you to know before I was too big to pretend otherwise." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "Are you well?" She said she was well. She said the dates were right, and she had examined herself carefully, and she believed everything was progressing correctly. I said, "You're not frightened?" She said, "I didn't say that." Then she said, "I'm also not asking you to manage my fear. I'm telling you something that's true." I said, "All right." I put my hand on her face. She did that to me, held my face, and I'd started doing it back without noticing. I said, "I'm glad." She leaned her forehead against my chest. She said, muffled, "I'm glad too. I was worried you'd be frightened." I said, "I am frightened." She laughed, and it came up through her chest and into mine, and I held her there in the cold morning, and I thought about my mother and the line of women before her, and what it meant that this was how it continued. Differently than anyone had expected, not through blood alone, but through whatever this was, whatever you called what Nora and I had made in 9 months of hard winters and letters and fires, and the kind of conversations I hadn't had with anyone since my mother was alive. My mother would have liked this woman. I kept coming back to that. It felt like permission, or maybe just recognition. Our son was born in April. The birth was long, and I will not pretend it wasn't frightening. Nora had attended many births. She had never been the one on the ground, which is a different thing. Tehinchala was there, and 2 of the women Nora had worked alongside all winter, and I waited outside, and I will tell you plainly that it was the longest night of my life. When it was over, Tehinchala came out first, and she looked at me. She was nearly 80 years old, this woman, and she had seen everything there was to see, and she looked at me and she nodded once. That was all. That was enough. I went inside. Nora was exhausted in the way that lives past exhaustion, past the point where the body knows what it is anymore. She was lying on the robes, and she had her eyes open, and the child was wrapped against her chest. She looked at me when I came in, and she said, "In Lakota." She'd gotten very good at Lakota, she said. "Come here." I sat beside her. The child was small and very new, and had a particular smell I did not have a word for. Nora moved the wrapping so I could see his face properly. He had her coloring and my shape, and his eyes were the unfocused dark of all newborns, and he was making a sound between sleeping and waking, a low sound like water. I said, "What do we call him?" She said, "You decide. You know the names better than I do." I thought about it. I said, "Chanwape Leaf, because he came in April when the first leaves come." She turned that over. Then she said, "Chanwape," slowly, getting the sounds right. She looked down at him and she said it again. I put my hand on her forehead. She was warm but not feverish. She closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them. She said, "I wasn't sure I could do this." I said, "Which part?" She said, "Any of it." Then she said, "All of it." I said, "You did." She looked up at me. There was something in her face I want to try to describe accurately. Not triumph, not sentiment. Something quieter than that. Like a person who has walked a long way and arrived, finally, at a place they had almost stopped believing in. She looked at me like that and she said, very quietly, "Yes, I did." Prout was replaced in the spring. The man who came after him was named Dowles, and he was neither better nor worse in any significant way, just different. The territory went on doing what territories do. The arguments about land and rights went on. Fulton and I corresponded through the following years about case after case. Some won and some lost, and most somewhere in the middle. But I am not telling you that story. That story is long and it is not finished, and it will not be finished in my lifetime. That is a different telling. I am telling you this one. There is an evening I come back to, maybe 4 years after Chanwape was born. He was walking by then and talking, and he had inherited from Nora a particular intensity of attention. The way he looked at things, solving them, which was her. He had inherited from me a stubbornness that Nora said she preferred to call steadiness when she was being generous. It was evening, late summer, and we were sitting outside the lodge in the last of the light. Chanwape was asleep inside. The camp was quiet. Nora was reading something. She always had something to read, papers from St. Louis, a medical journal she got sent out from Chicago, letters from her brother. I was working on a piece of tack that needed restoring. She said, without looking up, "Do you ever think about what you would have done if I hadn't stayed?" I thought about it. I said, "Yes." She said, "And?" I said, "I think I would have gone on the way I was going," which was not bad, but it was. I paused, looking for the word. I said, "It was a very long silence." She looked up from her reading. She looked at me the way she had in the creek bed the first time, solving something. She said, "You're not silent now." I said, "No." She put her reading down. She moved close to me and she put her head against my shoulder, the way she sometimes did, and I put my arm around her and we sat there in the last light with the camp around us, and the sound of the grassland breathing its late summer sound, insects and wind, and somewhere a horse moving. I thought about my mother. I thought about the line of women who had carried certain things in this band and how the line had come down to me, unexpected, and how I had carried it alone and how now I was not alone. She had not seen my worth when no one else did. Other people saw it more or less. She had seen something else. She had seen that I was carrying something alone, and she had decided, with no drama and no ceremony, to carry it with me. And she had not asked my permission to love me. She had just told me plainly, the way she told everything that was true, and she had stayed. My mother's line. My mother used to say that the knowledge passed through whoever paid attention. Nora paid attention. I held her in the last of the summer light and I thought, this is what it is to be known. Not admired, not needed, not used. Known. The whole of it, the tired parts and the afraid parts and the parts that had been carrying something too long, seen and not frightened off by any of it. The grassland went on breathing. The light went low and then lower. Chanwape would wake before long, demanding something, because he was a child who demanded things, which his mother considered a virtue. I stayed where I was. There is no better way to end this than that, I think. A man at a fire with his wife's head on his shoulder, and the grassland going dark, and the weight he'd been carrying so long it had started to feel like his own shape, not gone but shared, distributed differently, bearable. That is the story, that is the whole of it. Nora would say I left things out. She's probably right. But she's not here to correct me at the moment, which means you're getting my version, and my version is this. A woman with cold, chapped hands and carbolic-smelling tools and no patience for pretense came into my camp in the middle of a fever season and saw something worth knowing and decided she would know it. And she did. And that was enough, more than enough. More than I had any right to expect from this life, and exactly what my mother's particular, difficult, lonely, worthy line deserved.